of the many wonderful things about fall is the fact that apples are in season and we can make lots of different things with apples, including, but not limited to, apple pie. Apple pie isn't just delicious and fun to make, it also teaches us a lot about chemistry. There's a lot of science we can learn from making an apple pie, so let's do that. There are a bunch of different recipes out there for pie. I'm going to use a really simple recipe that I originally saw in the book How to Make an Apple Pie and See the World, because it's just easy and it goes over the things that I want to go over. To start with our crust, I'm going to start with flour and butter. Normally when you make pie crust, you use unsalted butter and you add some salt to it. But I don't have unsalted butter, so I'm going to use some salted butter. The recipe I'm using calls for 1 teaspoon of salt and 2 sticks of butter. Usually they're around 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt in 2 sticks of butter, so I just need to add about 1/4 teaspoon of salt to my dough. So I'm going to start with 2 cups of flour. Since I'm using salted butter, I'm only adding 1/4 teaspoon. I'm going to spill it everywhere. Boop. So next I'm going to kind of just make sure that the salt's kind of mixed in, get out the big clumps of, what are they called? I almost said clumps of dirt. Big clumps of flour. Now I'm going to add my butter. I'm going to cut this into some chunks. Now there are a couple ways to do this. There are pastry tools that kind of mush it up. They kind of have the little lines, and now you can also use just a fork and kind of mush it that way. Or the best method is to use no tools at all and just kind of toss the flour around it. Makes it, to me, this is always the most effective method. Hands are handy. I'm funny. Should be a stand-up comedian. We don't want hard pie crust, we want soft, fluffy pie crust. We want it to be delicious and airy. So we're not going to over-process it. We're just going to mix in the bits of butter just enough. We want it to have a mealy texture, so I don't want big chunks. Make sure I break those up. The goal here is just to kind of incorporate the fat with the flour. So right now I'm just concentrating on finding the big chunks. It's starting to get more of a mealy texture. Now if I was making bread, I would just keep working the dough for 20-30 minutes to build up the gluten, but again, I want soft, flaky pie crust, not hard pie crust. Next I have a little cup with some ice water in it. I'm going to add a few tablespoons of water. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ooh, it's chilly. You can see it's starting to be more dough-like. It's still pretty dry though. More water. 1, 2. The goal here is that when I pick it up, I can kind of mush it into dough. So you can see that kind of forms and stays as dough. So that looks like a good amount of water. Don't want to add too much. They really like to make homemade bread, so it's going against every instinct I have to not keep kneading this. So I will stop. So next I'm going to take some plastic wrap. Take my plastic wrap and put about half of my dough on there. You can also use wax paper, or parchment paper would work too, but that's kind of expensive, so you know, I'm not making money over here. Fancy people use parchment paper. Whenever you're rolling something out, you want to start in the middle and roll up, in the middle and roll down. And there's a cat attacking my foot. I just want it to be, we just want to knock over the bowl off the side. That's what we want to do. Make it as even as possible. I realize I'm using the rolling pin wrong, but forgive me. When it doesn't turn out quite as pretty as we want, we call it rustic. It's not deformed pastries, they're rustic. Okay, so I roll this up to a nice good sheet. So that one's sitting flat in my fridge, and I'm going to roll out the rest of the dough. Wheat flour contains 2 main proteins, gliadin and gluten. Proteins are molecules that have long chains of little units called amino acids. So some unit that repeats itself a bunch of times, each of those is considered a monomer, and you have a bunch of them, it's a polymer. Even though these long chains are linear, because of the structure and other forces within the atom, they can coil in on each other and make different 3-dimensional shapes. So gliadin ends up being little spheres, long chain of sphere-like structures, and glutenin ends up being long and rope-like. When you combine wheat flour with water and you mix it and work it a lot, they kind of mesh together. They end up mixing together and forming like a network. The more you stretch and work the dough, the more you stretch out these gluten molecules and create bonds with the gliadin molecules, which creates that network of materials that makes it a lot stronger, which is really good for bread, but not so good for pie crust. Gluten itself is wonderful. It's stretchy and chewy, and it's what makes regular bread delicious. But in pie crust, we don't want that stretchy chewiness. We want it to be flaky and fall apart easily. That's why it's important to not work the dough too much. Here I have 2 tablespoons of butter. I'm going to soften this for just a few seconds in the microwave. I'm going to add 3/4 cups of sugar.
Put sugar in jars after I've opened it. So I can't put it away. So this is a 1/2 cup with markings for 4/4 cups and halfway through. Add a little wine and then dention, so I'm going to 1/4 cup. So 3/4 cup.
The little toss with the old fork. 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Just mix that up. 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I didn't fill it all the way up because there is some salt in the butter. Almost knocked the whole thing over. That would have been so funny and so bad. I would have cried. Now next, for our apple pie, we need to add apples. I just blew your mind. It is kind of nice as you're making it to kind of eat extra. Now the best way for a pie is to cut lots of thin slices and lay them flat, but I'm super lazy, so that's not going to happen. Now the skins are going to be super tough, so you'll want to have a small knife to kind of peel the skins off. And I'm just going to take the apple itself, pour the apple in my cinnamon and sugar mixture to keep it from browning, because the sugar blocks the oxygen from reacting with the apple cells, so it doesn't cause oxidation and turn it brown as quickly. And then I'm just going to give it a nice little stir every time. Get more spoons. Go from there. I'm going to do probably 5 to 7 apples, depending on how much stuff I get out of them and how much skin I end up eating. An apple browns when you slice it because of enzymes that are in the apple's flesh. Enzymes are special proteins that act as catalysts. Catalyst is something that speeds up a chemical reaction. A biological catalyst will speed up some kind of biological reaction. In any kind of reaction, a catalyst will help it overcome that activation energy, the energy needed to start the reaction. So here you have your graph. This is how much energy you start off with, and this is how much you need for the reaction to continue on its own. So this amount that you need to go up is your activation energy. A catalyst helps either lower the activation energy or bring up your strain energy to that point. So you don't need to put in quite so much energy for the reaction to continue on its own. The reaction is between the enzymes in the fruit flesh and the oxygen in the air. That's an oxidation reaction, kind of like rusting or fire. Apples browning, it seems so anticlimactic compared to fire. These enzymes would naturally cause the fruit to ripen, and then eventually it would over-ripen and turn brown at some point when it got gross and old, right? But exposing it to oxygen just sends them into motion. It speeds this reaction right along. To prevent this from happening, you can either eat it right away, or you can cover it in some kind of acid like lemon juice, a mild acid. Let's not go crazy here. So normally you have your enzyme and your oxygen, and they come together and they cause browning. An acid will completely break apart the enzyme and make it so it doesn't work anymore, and then it can't react with the oxygen. Sugar will cause a barrier. It will coat the enzyme so it can't react with the oxygen. Both these methods work, but we want to add a little bit of sugar to our pie to make it delicious, so we're using the coating with sugar method. Alright, so now I'm done slicing my apples, and you might be able to see it here, but it gets kind of a juice that kind of came off of it. That's just the juice from the apples. It comes out from slicing them. I have my dough that's been sitting in the fridge. I'll take the plastic wrap off. Try to take the plastic wrap off. You can see it's a lot less squishy and it's easier to take it off now. Whee! It's so fun. Alright, so I'm just going to pop that in my wonderful pie plate. Ah. Gently. So I'm just going to kind of gently pat it into place. You might notice that this kind of looks like butt. That's okay though. So it's formable. I'm just going to form it into the pan. A little hole so that it doesn't get a bubble. I'm just going to trim off my edges. Everyone does this a little differently. I am super lazy, so that's how I do it. In a lazy way. Clean that up a bit. I'm going to take my filling here. Just kind of put it on in here. It's a little liquidy. That doesn't bother me. Nice and yummy apple filling. The goal here is to spread it out as evenly as possible. Like I said, you could do it sliced and put it in all purdy. Just don't have patience. I am such a good cook!
I'm so humble too.
Yes, no one's better at being humble than me. I'm going to try to take my top off. I'm no expert chef. I just have fun with it and enjoy the science behind it. It's not deformed, it's rustic. Right.
Rustically deformed.
This will bake down a bit. I'm just going to pat it a little bit. As the apples bake, they're kind of going to release a lot of steam and then start to deflate a bit. Something to be aware of. Ooh, I should stuck to that. Don't touch it. Now it's not much to look at, but that's okay. Where'd my knife go? Oh, I should have left the marble lid. That's okay. So I'm just going to kind of push this on the edges. Now you can take all these little pieces and make fancy designs and stuff on top if you feel so inclined. Just remember, the more you work the more you work the dough, the more gluten will build up, the harder your crust has a potential to be.
So if you barely use it, it can be soft.
Yeah, that's the goal, soft and flaky. But it has to be enough that it actually is mixed properly and forms a dough. It's about balance. Goldilocks pie crust.
There's no barriers.
I'm just gonna kind of mush the edges with a fork to kind of smush them together and give it a little bit of a fancy look. Now it's very important to vent a pan because you're gonna have a lot of steam building up there and you don't want to go in your oven. It will make that sound. So I'm just gonna cut some mince. Okay, if I cut the apples too, I forgive myself. Now one of the best chemical reactions is called the Maillard reaction. It's spelled like maillard, but it's a French dude, so what can you do? Maillard reaction is what makes meat brown and what gives bread its crispiness. The Maillard reaction occurs between amino acids, which make up proteins, and sugars. So the more proteins we can add, the more of a reaction we'll get. Now, this is tricky. So I just want an egg yolk. So there, we separated my white out. I'm gonna put this over here. So there's an egg yolk. You need about a teaspoon of water with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my egg yolk. That sounds weird. I'm going to beat the egg yolk. Show it who's boss. I'm just going to take my brush and kind of...
Why do you put eggs in it?
This egg wash will allow the pie to brown, so that way it has a much better flavor and it brings out the sugars, the natural sugars in the pie. So we'll have a yummy, delicious golden brown crust. Whee! Wow, that's good. You don't have to use the whole egg. Dang it, I played myself.
It's not much work, but when you do it, it's like...
So there is my lovely pie. And into the oven it goes. Oh, it dribbled. Look at that beautiful brownness. Okay, so here's our pie in our pie pan. Looks nice and beautiful and brown, and I kind of broke it when I was checking it, but that's okay. See, the crust is nice and flaky. Did discover that it was a little bit overfilled, so I'm gonna make another one with all the apples one of my really kind neighbors gave me, and maybe not fill that one up so much. The Maillard reaction is what happens when proteins, or amino acids in the proteins, react with certain sugars at around 140 degrees Celsius. Now that's about 284 Fahrenheit for the Americans in the room. Now this is an approximation. I made this pie at 375 Fahrenheit, and it browned very beautifully. I'm so proud. Since it happens at a higher temperature, that's why boiling your food doesn't give it that brownish tint. Since water boils at 100 Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit, that's below the temperature of the Maillard reaction. So that's why you don't get any kind of browning effect on food when you boil it. In our pie, the proteins in the egg react with the sugars in the crust. They combine and form different combinations that change the flavor and the color of the food. One of the ways we know a chemical reaction has occurred is because of the color change. Also, flavor change is another indication, but if it's not food, don't taste your reactions, kids. Don't have a pie server, so Oh, I broke it. That's okay. So what happens when you don't have a pie server. See, the crust is nice and flaky. Oh, it's hot. And delicious. It is already so good. After the first piece, the other pieces came out a lot better. So you can see they kind of formed together. Not much left in there. The natural pectins found in the apples worked well for more of a jelly texture. And it is delicious. Okay, here's my second pie. This one used some homemade apples my wonderful neighbor gave to me. And I didn't feel it quite as full, so hopefully we won't get as much spillage in the oven. Oopsies. So we'll try this one out and let you know how it goes. It's beautiful. Ideally, I should wait till this is completely cool before I eat it, but warm pie is delicious, so here we go. I broke it. Right now you can see some of the juices that are still pretty runny in there. And this piece of pie is kind of falling apart a little bit, but look at that crust. Oh my goodness. Oh, so good. Oh, it's so good. So worth it. So it's been a while. Here's my delicious pie. It's still a little warm, like an hour later. I also should mention that this one I cooked at a lower temperature. The first one I cooked at 425 degrees for about 25 minutes, and then I lowered the temperature to 375 and then cooked it for another 5-ish minutes. This one I cooked for about 45 minutes at 375 degrees, but during the last 10 minutes I put aluminum foil over the top because the top browned, but it wasn't all the way cooked, so it wouldn't brown anymore, but the bottom could still brown. You can also see that it has gelatinized quite a bit now. See if I put my finger across there, you can see that's very delicious. And now let's try cutting into it. Look at that. How pretty. Now it's a lot less runny. Same pie. You can see it forms together a lot better since I let it cool, but it's so good warm. When it's warm and falling apart, it's delicious. The pectin in my pie filling was able to kind of gelatinize and form those bonds between the different parts of my pie. So what holds this pie together? What keeps it from spilling everywhere? Well, not a lot, according to the first slice we took. You may have heard of people adding a substance called pectin to pie filling, to jams, to jelly, to help hold it together. Funny story, I had a roommate in college who had the nickname of pectin. I guess she was the glue that held us all together. Aww. So what pectin is long chains of carbohydrates. All organic molecules are going to be carbon-based. They're long chains of carbon with other stuff attached to it. It's weird. So these long chains of carbohydrates can bind to each other with intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces are the forces between molecules. Quite often, intermolecular forces are caused by electrons being pulled more strongly to one part of the molecule than another, creating a slightly positive and negative side of the molecule. Or it can be because the electrons are moving around so quickly that it can occasionally cause a slight difference in electronegativity, or how strong electrons are attracted at that given moment. So these intermolecular forces, these attractions between the different molecules, form kind of a gel. So all the molecules are attached to each other. Pectin is found naturally in plant cell walls, but some plants contain more pectin than others. Apples, for example, contain a lot of pectin. Sometimes when you make a pie with low pectin fruits, you'll add apples to it to give it some natural pectin. The thing is, pectin eventually will break down with heat, so you don't want to cook your pie too long, but you also have to let the pectin cool down to actually form that gel. So that's why when I put into my first pie a little too soon, it kind of oozed out everywhere, and then later on, it was a little more structured because it had a chance to cool. Just got ahead of myself. I just love the pie. It was so delicious. I was so excited. Not too mushy, but not crunchy. The crust is nice and flaky. It's delicious, and that's what matters most. If you're interested in more explanations of day-to-day phenomena, or science you can do at home, or applications of science to your daily life, or science of the fall, make sure you subscribe. Different recipes on the internet. On the internet. Why are you putting the cat in there? Get the cat away from the food.
She's not near the food.
She's by the water.
Look at her.
She's a parrot. Apples did the apples. I just dropped some on my foot. Don't tell anyone. How many times can I say pectin? Pectin. Oopsies. That are in the apple's flesh. That sounds morbid. Caution cutting edge. Well, caution, I can't open this stupid thing. That's the caution. Browns when you slice it, that's the word. But